Thank you very much. I'm very grateful to be here. I've started to come to this country again after about 35 years. I was a student in France, and I used to sort of come off here long, long ago, but last year and a half I've been coming back. I must apologize to you, I suspect, for being here at quite this moment, because I rather imagine at least all the Irish in this room are more thinking about what happened in the last couple of days than about the global food crisis, no matter how important you deem it to be. I think Liam Kennedy and I set these dates before the elections had been called, obviously, for this weekend, and by the time we realized all that, it was too late to change it. So with that apology in mind, it's been, of course, fascinating for me to be here at that time, but not really sort of, what I have to say may seem a little remote, at least until Wicklow declares. Let me start with a broader question. I should say very quickly, I've spent a lot of time reporting from the Maghreb and the Arab Middle East and Iraq and Pakistan and Afghanistan, but I'm not an expert in any of these places. I have, on the other hand, spent 25 years trying to think about development, particularly in the field of emergency relief, but laterally about development proper and its discontents, if I dare put it that way, and also increasingly about the global food crisis, with special concern about chronic malnutrition, and I'll come back to that in a moment, but I want to emphasize that once you start talking about chronic malnutrition, of course, which doesn't kill people, which can't be portrayed adequately in the electronic media or on the web, but is a question of babies and small children being underweight or under their appropriate heights, and with the silent neurological and biochemical damage that this does. These are questions, obviously, that have to be thought of in a very different register, intellectual register, from emergency relief, from the activities of the organizations we know so well from the 90s and the noughts in places as various as Bosnia and Sierra Leone and even Iraq in some ways. However, I do think there's a connection, but let me start, if I may, with the food crisis. There are approximately 7 billion people in the world. Of that 7 billion, 1 billion, or 1 in 7, are chronically malnourished in some way. It doesn't have to be calorie malnourished. The malnourishment can take the form of lacking appropriate vitamins or minerals in the diet. In other words, it can be a problem with diet, even if the calorie count coincides with WHO, standards. But those calories, the calories nutritionists call empty calories, and therefore often, although they keep people alive in terms of brain development for small children, et cetera, during the period of gestation. And it really is early childhood, I emphasize, where chronic malnutrition is at its most catastrophic. Adults who become chronically malnourished, but who are not malnourished as small children and as infants, have much better outcomes than people who are malnourished early, even if they are later properly nourished. And I want to emphasize that because it puts into question a development strategy that has been used by many agencies and many governments and many NGOs in many contexts, which is to emphasize primary schooling and up. There are a lot of people who think that that's too late, that the emphasis is wrong, that by the time you get kids into primary schools, the damage is done to them. There's a lot of work, a lot of neurobiology been done, in Canada in particular, at the Brothers Foundation, has done an extraordinary where you can go there and you see the damage. It's as simple as that. It's not debatable anymore biologically. That argument is settled. Now, what we do about it, of course, not settled at all. But it's very important. You see, I mean, there's also, and there are problems with that because for a minister in a poor country or a local politician to build a school gives that local politician, minister, government credit at home and credit in international institutions. I should quickly say that I'm going to avoid the word international community because I think it's a self-serving myth that such a thing exists. I think it's self-flattering, but I don't. If a community implies that common values and common purposes, then in no way, shape, or form, it seems to me, can we say that there was or is, in my opinion, likely to be an international community. There is a European community, I think. I think it's fair to say that. The problem is, again, just to take my example, and my example is Middle East, Africa, any poor place. It may even be in the rich world. My own country has higher rates of chronic malnutrition than you'd think, and once you factor in obesity, which I don't consider to be malnutrition, even though it's often described in tandem with chronic malnutrition, then, of course, the developed world is having quite severe case of this collectively. Not only the developed world, but the middle-class countries like Mexico, for example, where obesity is approaching first world standards, developed world standards at this point, levels, excuse me, at this moment. There's a real problem, the problem that I was describing earlier, which is that chronic malnutrition is not portrayable. Therefore, you can't mobilize public opinion in the way that you can for a famine as easily. I'm sure you can do it, but it's a harder sell. And it is a sell. I mean, remember, any development agency is competing with other departments of government. Any NGO interested in these questions is competing with the cancer charity, the dog and cat hospital, and indeed, the old boys and now girls organization from the university. This is not a system where funds are allocated rationally. This is a system where funds are allocated, as if you will, from the heart, not the head. And while governments can somewhat mitigate this reality, they certainly can't change it. They themselves, as we know, if you to shift the ground slightly, if you describe where humanitarian military interventions have taken place, you can correlate that directly with three questions. One, interests, of course. Interests are always going to play a role. The second is how much public pressure in the intervening countries can be mobilized. And then, of course, the third are a whole series of needs-based criteria, which are perhaps more rational. Thus, there was an intervention to break the siege of Sarajevo eventually. There was no intervention to break the siege of Quito in Angola some years earlier. I lived in Sarajevo for a great deal of the siege, so I'm not going to say that I'm sorry that there was no intervention, and I don't think in any case it's particularly morally sound to make the great the enemy of the good, but we should acknowledge that. By the same token, development aid is subject to many such pressures. In my own country, the Hillary Clinton State Department has just issued the first of what is, they say, will be a quadrennial review of states' policies modeled on the U.S. Defense Department's quadrennial review. And very ambitious projects are outlined. A new program called Feed the Future, which puts agriculture at the center in a way it hasn't been for a very long time. An expansion, at least as described, of some of the Bush large-scale medical and health programs in the Global South. But it remains to be seen whether there'll be any money for any of this. Because that's appropriated. And appropriators don't appropriate, again, on rational bases. They appropriate on political bases. And those are in play now. And it may very well be that all this, this will be, as a Russian poet I used to know like to say, as irrelevant as a comma in Tolstoy. There may be no, there actually may be no money for these programs. Or anyway, not enough money to do the ambitious things these programs wanted to be. Now, if the early childhood development people are right, and if, when they say that outcomes for people who are chronically malnourished, life chances of all types, from health outcomes over the course of their lives to their ability to follow in school, to questions of job performance, that is, say, being able to work in a place, in a hierarchical environment where they're expected to be on time, say, that these outcomes are all worse for chronically malnourished people. And I believe that, again, as I said slightly earlier, I believe the science to be absolutely beyond doubt at this point. It's not like climate change, where there are objections. I never talk about climate change not being a scientist, because I really feel, that starts to be opinion, sort of punditry of the worst sort. What do I know about climate change? But you can see this stuff. Ask any neurobiologist, and they will show you it's not a controversial question, although I suppose there must be some Tea Party group somewhere in the United States that would question it. The problem then is that chronic malnutrition, it's a vicious cycle. Chronic malnutrition creates poorer life chances and less qualified people in the largest sort of meta sense of that word, which in turn reinforces poverty, et cetera, et cetera. Now, even in countries, and I'm going to move to the Islamic Middle East as advertised in a moment, even in countries where my mother used to speak of, the Quakers had an expression that my late mother was very fond of, the sense of the meeting. Well, the sort of global sense of the meeting is that the future belongs to China and India. Now, personally, I don't think the future belongs to anybody, and this seems to me, frankly, sort of Spenglerian footling. But having said that, I ask you, even if you don't believe it's Spenglerian footling, how can a country inherit the future that has 46% child malnutrition rate, the highest proportional rate, not just rate in absolute numbers, in the world, namely India, the Indian Union, whose best states, like Kerala, have the same aggregate rates as sub-Saharan Africa in toto, 29%. That's the best state. That's the miracle state. That's the place, the American Silicon Valley executives have all kinds of sort of wonderful dreams and feelings about. What that means is the country that's thought to be teetering on the brink of inheriting the future is going to have, population of India is 1.2 billion, so that's about 500 million people who will be unfit for the workforce, and who, again, these are the sorts of things that make one say we have to rethink development. And the Arab Middle East seems to me a very good example of what happens when you go down the same track in your thinking, both about development and about politics, on the sort of hold on to nurse for fear of finding something worse principle. That is to say, Mubarak is awful, we know that, but he signed the peace deal with the Israelis and he reliably keeps the Egyptian side of the blockade of the Gaza Strip going, and he's a good ally in the war against the Taliban. As you may have noticed, when Colonel Gaddafi made, I believe, the second of his rather picturesque speeches, he blamed Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. He had blamed the Americans in the first speech, and now he took to blaming Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. I read that as some attempt to play the card that he'd been playing ever since the rapprochement, ever since he gave up, in effect, being a terrorist sponsor and made his deals with Tony Blair and others. Because that was the trick that worked. All these dictators in the Arab Middle East could, in effect, say, you don't like us, look, here's the hard-nosed truth. The choice is between us and the Muslim Brotherhood, us and the Taliban, us and Hezbollah, us and Hamas. Well, a choice is only a choice if it works as a choice. I mean, a choice is not a choice if choosing Mubarak or Ben Ali or Colonel Gaddafi is a losing hand. Then you'd be much better off seeing if you can make a deal with the Muslim Brotherhood or Hamas or Hezbollah and, in effect, try to persuade some faction of them to pursue different policies. I mean, I hardly need in this country to tell you about the need for negotiations with people whose initial starting points are totally unacceptable. I mean, surely the history of this country in the last 30 years is precisely doing this, or this island, put it that way. Now, the fact of the matter is that if we talk about development in these countries, development was completely screwed. It was subordinate to the neglected relative of, pick your florid image, I've offered two, there are many more, of military assistance. So the American contribution to Egypt was 1.3 billion per annum in direct military credits. It was about less than half that in development aid. And the difference was that in the case of the military credits, at least Washington could say to itself, we get something back. We get the Egyptians doing what we want, or more or less doing what we want, in terms of the Israel-Palestine dispute, in terms of the pushback against Shiism, which has been one of the principal activities of these leaders, most importantly, the Egyptian leadership under the Mubarak dictatorship, and of course the Saudis, who have been, there has been a kind of proxy war across the Arab Middle East and the Maghreb between Iran and Saudi, and in that Egypt very much seconded Saudi. And if you look at the WikiLeaks, actually, in this instance, are quite informative. An American general is visiting, this is 2009 leak for Embassy Cairo, U.S. Embassy Cairo, and it says that it's informing some senior Pentagon official who's about to come to Cairo and meet with both the Chief of General Staff and President Mubarak, that the Egyptians consider the $1.3 billion in military aid to be their due, that there can be no conditions attached to it because they've already paid. They've paid by the Arab-Israeli treaty, the Egyptian-Israel treaty. They've paid by all the things that I tried to elaborate a couple of minutes ago. We, the U.S., speaking as an American, we gave this aid with strings. It's just the strings were all front-loaded, if you will. The strings were in the initial deal. Development aid has never had any strings. That's why, on a micro level, it's often been extremely successful. But on a macro level, it's been singularly unsuccessful. If you look at health outcomes among the poor in Egypt, they're no better now than they were a decade ago before economic liberalization. What has happened is, as in many other parts of the world, neoliberal economics, as someone on the left like me, full disclosure, blah, 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 would say, to the extent it's worked, it has created a middle class. Even people of my politics readily concede that fact. Same is true of India, incidentally. The same is true of China, et cetera, et cetera. But what has not happened is any serious, in the 10 years of economic liberalization, any impact on the macro statistics of poverty in Egypt. The Ben Ali dictatorship, which had, obviously, in Tunisia, which had a very much smaller population, which had considerably, where things like inputs of tourism, investment, Italian investment, even quite a large European expat community, particularly French and Italian, that lived there and therefore supported parts of the local economy, didn't, for the bottom 50% of Tunisians, it had no effect, which is probably one of the reasons you saw the first effect of the fall of Ben Ali being as many people as possible cramming into boats and trying to get to Italy as fast as possible. There was a famous, as Bertolt Brecht, the Marxist German playwright and poet, said, first grub, then ethics. And I tend to subscribe to that view myself. But anyway, whether you do or you don't, it's simply a fact that the Tunisian people have had no confidence in this. And I will bet you any amount of money that the tide from Libya starts soon, unless Europe intervenes and sets up a Frontex mission and some kind of giant effort at refoulement, which is possible, I suppose. It may even be likely, or more likely than not. Depends, I suppose, how many people come. The Americans did that with the Haitians and the Cubans. I mean, you could do it here in the Mediterranean. The point is that to the extent in the Arab Middle East that we pushed anything, we pushed a liberalization of the economy. That is, we pushed for getting the state out of the economy and the private sector into the economy. That was our move. And that indeed did create this middle class, but it didn't create any sort of trickle down to the genuinely poor. And you had in the rebellions, in both the uprisings, in both Egypt and Tunisia, a combination, a kind of shifting combination of participation by the poor and participation by this new middle class. In Egypt, I actually think it was dominated by this new middle class, which is why I'm rather pessimistic about the outcome in Egypt. In Tunisia, it's much more dominated by the poor, hence the fact that the middle-class governments have continued to have to resign. You will have noted, those of you at least who follow these questions, that Mr. Ghannouchi, who was the premier under Ben Ali, who was kept on in the name of unity, first was forced to sack all the former Ben Ali ministers, and now was forced to resign. He was forced to resign by popular pressure. I think that no Tunisian government will be able to ignore the demands of the people who have not benefited from the prosperity of their middle class. I'm not at all persuaded that will be the case in Egypt. And as far as Libya goes, frankly, Libya is a clan-based country. It seems to be more likely that a clan that will be an opposition clan to Gaddafi's clan will come. Now, Gaddafi is a charismatic figure, and it's very unlikely that Libya will produce another one right away. So you could argue that a non-charismatic person, a less experienced person, a less self-confident person, may be more amenable to the tutelage of the UN and other international institutions, and thus the outcome for Libyans will be better. But let me put it very starkly. Most people the average age in the Islamic world, I believe, in the Arab Middle East, is 20. It may have gone up to 22, as people enter the curve down. I'm not absolutely sure. I should have looked the figures up before I came here. But poor young people, they can't all immigrate to Europe. You won't let them. No matter how porous your borders, you're not going to permit that. So what's going to be done for them? I would submit that so far, at least, far from development having been a success in this context, because we've not had an overarching idea about what we wanted, the way we did about liberalization of the economy and the way we did about geostrategy, hence in the military realm. Instead, we just did these programs, many of them according to our own norms, what the fashion of a particular time in the development world is, and the development world has fashions just like every other world, sometimes as a response to what we thought they wanted. Occasionally, and this is, of course, we were speaking about this before it came up here, there is in war zones, in the places where the U.S. is fighting its long war, we tend to not give aid according to development principles, but according to military principles. We're interested in winning hearts and minds. That's what we do. And I don't disagree with that in some way. I think that's what has to happen. But let's not call it development. I mean, that's at least not development as we know it elsewhere. Now, the real, the problem with the way we've thought about these things, is that there are the black swan events that Nassim Taleb talks about, the events we don't expect. The order that we think is stable at some point becomes unstable. And now we're actually playing catch up, if we're strictly talking about the Arab Middle East, in a region where we don't know who's going to come in. We don't have any development strategy. Everyone's pouring according to the interests of each group. So the Soros foundations are interested in democracy, so they're pouring money into Egypt and Tunisia to do democracy building with their grantees. And Gates Foundation's interested in health, and they have these health programs, and then the inputs come in according to what the global view is. This is not sound policy. It has not worked in the past, and unless we start getting a better idea in the future, we're going to have more events like this. And the fact is, these democratic revolutions, to the extent that that is their rhetoric, whether they're genuinely democratic or not, I don't know, but the rhetoric is democratic. If they fail, and the perception of their failure will be what happens to the poor if the lot of the poor, and in my context, the malnourished, is not addressed, is not ameliorated fairly quickly. At that point, there will be non-democratic revolutions to follow. That, I think, you can take to the bank. So, with that, I hope I've provoked you sufficiently, and I thank you for your attention.